July 23, 1956, 6:47 a.m. The corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street in Harlem. A delivery driver named Marcus Washington pulled his truck to the curb to make his morning drop at a corner grocery store and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. An 18-year-old girl's body lying in the alley between two buildings, partially covered by discarded newspapers, her face swollen beyond recognition from a beating so severe that witnesses later testified they'd never seen anything comparable. The girl was identified 3 hours later through a necklace her mother had given her for graduation the previous month. Her name was Dorothy Hayes, 18 years old, freshly graduated from Wadley High School, worked part-time at a beauty salon on 125th Street, planning to attend City College in September to study nursing. She lived with her mother and grandmother in a third-floor walk-up on West 138th Street and had no criminal record, no known involvement with any illegal activities, no reason anyone could identify for why she'd be targeted for violence. According to the medical examiner's report, Dorothy had been beaten with fists and a blunt object, possibly a baseball bat or tire iron. She'd suffered skull fractures, broken ribs, severe facial trauma, and injuries consistent with being kicked repeatedly while on the ground. The cause of death was listed as massive head trauma. Time of death was estimated between 11 p.m. on July 22nd and 2 a.m. on July 23rd. No witnesses came forward immediately. No suspects were identified. The NYPD's initial investigation treated it as they treated most violent crimes in Harlem in 1956. With minimal resources, limited urgency, and the quiet assumption that the victim must have been involved in something that led to her death, even though nothing in Dorothy Hayes' background suggested any such involvement. Detective William Murphy, assigned to the case at the 28th Precinct, interviewed Dorothy's mother, Geneva Hayes, at 11:34 a.m. on July 23rd. Geneva was a 47-year-old domestic worker who'd raised Dorothy alone after her husband died in World War II. She sat in her small apartment, surrounded by photographs of her daughter, graduation photos, birthday celebrations, Dorothy in her church choir dress, and tried to understand why anyone would hurt her child. Did Dorothy have a boyfriend? Murphy asked, his notepad ready. She dated a boy from church sometimes, Marcus Thompson, but they were just friends mostly. Going to movies, having sodas. Any enemies? Anyone who'd threatened her? Dorothy was quiet. She worked. She studied. She went to church. She helped me with bills. She took care of her grandmother. She wasn't in any trouble, detective. I need you to understand that. I understand, Mrs. Hayes. But someone did this to her. Someone had a reason. Geneva looked at the detective with the tired understanding of a black woman in 1956 Harlem who knew that police investigations in her community rarely resulted in justice, especially when the victim couldn't defend their own reputation. Will you find who did this? Murphy closed his notebook. We'll do our best, ma'am. But without witnesses or clear motive, these cases are difficult. So you're saying no. I'm saying it takes time. If we find evidence, we'll pursue it. But I can't make promises. Geneva Hayes knew what that meant. Her daughter's murder would join the dozens of unsolved cases that accumulated in Harlem precincts every year. Filed away, forgotten, accepted as the cost of living in a neighborhood that law enforcement saw as expendable. But Geneva Hayes had one resource that most mothers in her position didn't have. Her brother-in-law, Dorothy's uncle by marriage, was Raymond Red Campbell, Bumpy Johnson's longtime numbers banker and close friend. Red had worked for Bumpy since 1934, was trusted completely, and was one of the few people who could reach Bumpy on personal matters without going through layers of security and protocol. At 2:17 p.m. on July 23rd, 7 hours and 30 minutes after Dorothy's body was discovered, Red Campbell called Bumpy Johnson from a payphone and said 5 words that would set in motion events that would shock Harlem within 72 hours. They killed Dorothy Hayes, Bumpy. There was silence on the line. Then Bumpy's voice, ice cold. Geneva's niece? The girl going to college? Yes. Who did it? Police don't know yet, or they're not saying. But Bumpy, she was 18, just graduated. She was a good kid, and someone beat her to death in an alley like she was nothing. Another pause. Longer. Then, I'll handle it. Tell Geneva I'll handle it. Handle it how? However it needs to be handled. This doesn't stand. Not in Harlem. Not to one of ours. What happened next would become one of the most debated incidents in Bumpy Johnson's 40-year career. Not because of violence, though violence was involved, but because of what Bumpy Johnson accomplished in 3 days that the NYPD couldn't accomplish in 3 months. He identified Dorothy Hayes' killers, delivered them to justice, and sent a message that echoed through Harlem for years about who actually protected the community when official authorities failed. But the methods he used, and the consequences that followed, would demonstrate that even the most justified actions carry costs that can't be avoided, no matter how powerful you are. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Harlem in the summer of 1956. The neighborhood was home to approximately 237,000 people, roughly 95% of whom were black. It was the cultural and economic heart of Black New York. The Apollo Theater on 125th Street, the jazz clubs on Lenox Avenue, the churches that served as community anchors, the small businesses that lined every commercial block. But Harlem in 1956 was also struggling. The post-war economic boom that lifted white middle-class Americans wasn't reaching black communities at the same rate. Unemployment in Harlem ran about 12%, double the city average. Median family income was roughly 60% of the citywide median. Housing was overcrowded, with landlords subdividing apartments to pack more families into buildings designed for half their occupants. Crime was a constant concern. The NYPD's 28th Precinct, which covered central Harlem, reported 47 homicides in 1955, along with hundreds of assaults, robberies, and burglaries. Most went unsolved. Police presence in Harlem was minimal except during crackdowns, and when officers did patrol, they were often viewed as occupying force rather than protective service. This created a vacuum that informal power structures filled. Numbers operators like Bumpy Johnson weren't just criminals. They were community institutions that provided services the city didn't. They employed hundreds of people. They settled disputes. They provided loans when banks wouldn't. They funded community programs. They maintained order in ways that official law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't. By 1956, Bumpy Johnson was 51 years old and at the height of his influence. He controlled significant portions of Harlem's numbers racket, maintained relationships with Italian mob families, had connections to politicians ranging from city councilmen to congressmen, and commanded respect that came from being both feared and needed. But Bumpy's power had limits. He couldn't prevent every crime, couldn't protect every innocent person, couldn't be everywhere at once. Dorothy Hayes had been killed on a street Bumpy's organization controlled, in a neighborhood where his influence was strongest and nobody had prevented it or even witnessed it. That failure, that inability to protect an 18-year-old girl going to college, doing everything right, living the kind of life Bumpy wanted to see more young people living, cut deep. This wasn't business. This was personal. This was about what kind of community Harlem was and whether people like Dorothy Hayes could live safely in it. The NYPD had certain resources, legal authority, forensic capabilities, official investigative powers. But they also had limitations, political pressure to close cases quickly, racial bias that made them see Harlem victims as less important, and bureaucratic processes that moved slowly. Bumpy Johnson had different resources, street-level intelligence networks, people throughout Harlem who saw everything and reported to him, the ability to question witnesses who wouldn't talk to police, and freedom from legal constraints that restricted official investigations. He also had motivation the NYPD lacked. Dorothy Hayes was family to someone he trusted. Her murder reflected on Harlem's safety, and finding her killers would demonstrate that Bumpy's protection, The informal social contract between his organization and the community meant something real. Within hours of Red Campbell's phone call, Bumpy mobilized resources that would make the next 72 hours the most intensive investigative effort his organization had ever undertaken. July 23, 1956, 3 p.m. Bumpy Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. 6 people sat in Bumpy's living room. Benjamin "Benny" Williams, security chief; Nathaniel "Nat" Pettigrew, community liaison; Raymond "Red" Campbell, numbers banker and Dorothy's uncle by marriage; Marcus Webb, information coordinator; William "Clutch" Montgomery, logistics and transportation; and Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Queenie, now 74, but still consulted on major decisions. Bumpy laid out the situation. Dorothy Hayes, 18 years old, beaten to death sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. last night. Body found on Lenox and 132nd. No witnesses have come forward to police. No suspects identified. NYPD is treating it as routine investigation, which means minimal effort and low probability of resolution. What do we know about her movements last night? Stephanie asked. Red Campbell answered. She left work at the beauty salon at 6 p.m. Told her boss she was meeting a friend for dinner. She never came home. Who was the friend? Her mother doesn't know. Dorothy didn't say. Bumpy looked at Marcus Webb. I need you to reconstruct her last 12 hours. Talk to everyone who might have seen her. Beauty salon co-workers. People on her regular routes. Anyone at restaurants or diners between her work and where her body was found. Map everywhere she could have been. That's a lot of ground, Marcus said. Then use a lot of people. I want to know everyone who saw Dorothy Hayes between 6 p.m. Sunday and 2 a.m. Monday. Every sighting, every interaction, every detail. To Nat Pettigrew. Talk to the community. Church members, neighbors, local business owners. Someone saw something. Someone knows something. People won't talk to police, but they'll talk to you. Make it clear we're not looking to cause trouble. We're looking to find out who killed an 18-year-old girl who was doing everything right. To Clutch Montgomery. I need transportation ready. If we identify suspects, I need to be able to move people quickly and quietly. Have 3 vehicles available at all times. To Benny Williams, security. If word gets out that we're investigating, whoever did this might run or hide. I need people watching key locations, bus stations, train terminals, bridges out of Manhattan. If we identify suspects and they try to leave, I want to know. To Stephanie St. Clair, political cover. If we find who did this before police do, we'll need to handle it carefully. Talk to your contacts. Make sure that when this resolves, it resolves in a way that doesn't create bigger problems. Stephanie nodded. You're planning to deliver them to police? If possible. But first I need to find them. And I'm giving us 3 days. 72 hours. If we can't identify Dorothy's killers in that time, then whoever did this gets away with it. Why 3 days? Red asked. Because trail goes cold fast. Because witnesses forget or decide not to get involved. Because every hour that passes makes this harder. And because I won't let Dorothy Hayes become another unsolved case that Harlem just accepts. The meeting continued for another hour, assigning specific responsibilities, establishing communication protocols, setting up a coordinated investigation that would involve dozens of people working simultaneously across multiple tracks. By 4:30 p.m., 9 hours and 43 minutes after Dorothy's body was discovered, Bumpy's organization had mobilized an investigative effort that dwarfed anything the NYPD was doing. Day 1, July 23rd, for 30 p.m., midnight. Marcus Webb coordinated interviews with 23 people who worked on or near Dorothy's route from her job to where her body was found. The beauty salon where she worked closed at 7 p.m., giving Marcus access to her coworkers. Sarah Mitchell, who worked the chair next to Dorothy's, provided the first useful lead. Dorothy said she was meeting someone for dinner. A new friend, she said. Someone she'd met recently, but seemed excited about. She didn't give a name, just said they were meeting at a diner on 135th Street. Which diner? She didn't say specific, but there's only 3 diners on 135th between here and where she lived. Marcus visited all 3. At the third, Willie's Diner on 135th and 7th Avenue. The owner, Willie Jackson, remembered Dorothy, pretty young girl, came in around 7:15. Sat in a booth with 2 white guys. That stuck out because we don't get many white customers, especially not with young black girls. You remember what they looked like. One was maybe 30, brown hair, wore a leather jacket. Other was younger, mid-20s blonde. They ordered burgers and sodas. Sat there maybe 45 minutes. Then they all left together. Did they seem friendly? Threatening. At first friendly. But toward the end, the girl looked uncomfortable. Like she wanted to leave, but the men were insisting on something. I almost went over to check if she was okay, but then they got up and walked out. Which direction? East on 135th, toward Lenox. This was the break. Dorothy had been seen with 2 white men. Left the diner with them, heading toward where her body would be found. Willie described them in enough detail that Marcus had his sketch artist create composite drawings by 9 p.m. Meanwhile, Nat Pettigrew was working community sources. He spoke to a street vendor who'd been set up on Lenox Avenue near 132nd Street Sunday night and remembered seeing 2 white men in a car, a dark blue Chevrolet with Bronx plates, parked near the alley where Dorothy's body was discovered. What time? Around midnight. I remember thinking it was weird, white guys in that part of Harlem that late. They sat in the car for maybe 10 minutes, then drove away fast. Headed north on Lenox. You see the license plate? Not the full thing, but I remember it started with BX. That's how I know it was Bronx plates. By midnight on July 23rd, 17 hours and 13 minutes after Dorothy's body was discovered, Bumpy's investigation had established. Dorothy met 2 white men for dinner at Willie's Diner. She left with them around 8 p.m., heading toward Lenox Avenue. 2 white men in a blue Chevrolet with Bronx plates were seen near the crime scene around midnight. Physical descriptions and composite sketches had been created. The NYPD's investigation had established approximately none of this, having conducted only routine canvassing that turned up no witnesses willing to talk to police. Date 2, July 24th, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Bumpy Johnson didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours between midnight and dawn reviewing information, coordinating his team, and planning next steps. At 6:17 a.m., he received a call from Benny Williams with potentially crucial information. One of Bumpy's sources within the NYPD had seen Detective Murphy's case file and reported that there was one detail police had discovered but not publicized. Dorothy Hayes had defense wounds on her hands consistent with fighting back, and under her fingernails were skin cells that could potentially be used to identify her attackers if suspects were ever found. This was important. It meant Dorothy had fought. It meant there was physical evidence. It meant if Bumpy could identify suspects, police would have forensic evidence to support charges. At 8 a.m., Marcus Webb distributed the composite sketches throughout Harlem to barbers, grocery store owners, bartenders, anyone who might recognize the faces. The sketches went to over 200 locations with a simple message: 2 white men seen with Dorothy Hayes hours before she was killed. Anyone who recognizes them, contact Marcus Webb immediately. At 10:23 a.m., a bartender at a jazz club on Lenox Avenue called Marcus. I've seen these guys. They come in sometimes. Not regulars, but I've served them maybe 4, 5 times over the past 2 months. They're not from around here. Talk like they're from Queens or the Bronx. Always asking about girls, trying to pick up women. Got thrown out once for being too aggressive with a customer. You know their names? No, but one of them paid with a credit card once. I had to run it through our machine. I might still have the receipt carbon copy. The bartender found the receipt. Francis DeLuca. An Italian surname. Credit card issued by a Bronx bank. It was enough. Bumpy passed the name to contacts he had in various record-keeping offices, motor vehicles, utilities, property records. By 2 p.m., they had an address. Francis DeLuca, 28 years old, lived on Morris Avenue in the South Bronx, worked as a mechanic at a garage on 3rd Avenue. But they needed to confirm this was the same person before taking action. At 3 p.m., Benny Williams and two associates drove to the garage where DeLuca worked. They waited in an unmarked car until 5 p.m. when shift changed. A man matching the composite sketch, brown hair, leather jacket, approximately 30 years old, walked out of the garage, climbed into a blue Chevrolet with Bronx plates, and drove away. They'd found him. Benny followed DeLuca to a bar in the Bronx where he met another man, blonde, mid-20s, also matching the second composite sketch. The two men drank beers, played pool, and acted like they didn't have a care in the world, 48 hours after beating an 18-year-old girl to death. At 6:34 p.m., Benny called Bumpy. "We have positive identification. Francis DeLuca and associate. Don't have the second name yet, but working on it. Both match descriptions. Both were together tonight. Both are acting normal, like nothing happened. Where are they now?" "Still at the bar. Mickey's Tavern on 3rd Avenue and 156th Street in the Bronx. Stay on them. Don't engage. Just watch. I need to decide how to handle this." Bumpy hung up and faced a decision that would define the next 24 hours. What to do with this information? He could call the police, report what his investigation had uncovered, let the official system handle it. But that meant trusting the NYPD to actually prosecute, trusting that two white men accused of killing a black girl in Harlem would face real justice, which history suggested was unlikely. Or he could handle it differently, extract a confession, ensure they faced consequences. But that meant operating outside the law in ways that could create problems even for someone with Bumpy's political connections. At 7 p.m., Bumpy called a meeting with his core team plus two additional people, Raymond Marcus, his attorney, and Reverend Thomas Kilgore from Friendship Baptist Church. "We've identified Dorothy's killers," Bumpy began. Two men from the Bronx. Francis DeLuca and an associate we're still identifying. We have witnesses who saw Dorothy with them. We have physical descriptions that match. We have them under surveillance right now. Question is what we do next, Raymond Marcus said. If we turn this over to police without confession or additional evidence, there's no guarantee of prosecution. Two white men versus witness testimony from Harlem residents? That's a weak case for any prosecutor. So we need confession, Bumpy said. Confession obtained how? Marcus asked carefully. Because confession under duress isn't admissible. And if you extract it through methods that leave marks, you've just created a defense attorney's dream. Claim the confession was coerced, claim the suspects were brutalized, turn them into victims. Reverend Kilgore spoke up. Bumpy, I understand the frustration. I understand wanting justice for Dorothy. But if you extract confession through violence, you're no better than the men who killed her. I'm much better than the men who killed her, Bumpy replied coldly. But I take your point. So here's what we do. We bring them to a location where they can be questioned. We make them understand they have two choices. Confess to police and face legitimate justice, or refuse and face consequences that aren't legitimate but are certain. We don't torture. We don't brutalize. We just make very clear what their options are. That's still coercion, Marcus warned. It's motivation. There's a difference. The meeting continued for another hour, working through details, establishing protocols, ensuring that whatever happened next could be defended both legally and morally, or at least defended enough that Bumpy could live with the consequences. Day 3, July 25th, 12 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. At 12:47 a.m. on July 25th, 66 hours and 47 minutes after Dorothy Hayes' body was discovered, Francis DeLuca and his friend Robert Castellano left Mickey's Tavern in the Bronx, walked to DeLuca's blue Chevrolet, and drove toward Castellano's apartment. They never made it. 3 blocks from the bar, a car pulled in front of them at a red light. Another pulled up behind. When DeLuca tried to turn, a third car blocked that route. 6 men emerged, Benny Williams and 5 associates, and approached the Chevrolet from all sides. Step out of the vehicle, Benny said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Do it slowly. Keep your hands visible. DeLuca looked at Castellano, panicked. Who are these guys? I said step out. This is the only time I'll ask politely. They stepped out. Were frisked for weapons. DeLuca had a switchblade, Castellano a blackjack. Both were confiscated. Both men were guided into one of the cars and driven to a warehouse in the Bronx that Bumpy's organization used for storage. Inside the warehouse, Bumpy Johnson was waiting. Also present, Raymond Marcus, attorney, Reverend Kilgore, moral witness, and a court stenographer named Alice Williams who worked part-time for various lawyers and had been paid to document whatever was about to be said. DeLuca and Castellano were seated in chairs facing Bumpy. They weren't restrained, weren't touched, weren't threatened with violence. But 6 men stood along the walls, watching, making clear that leaving wasn't an option. My name is Ellsworth Johnson, Bumpy began, his voice quiet and cold. You know who I am? Both men nodded, fear replacing their earlier bravado. Good. Then you understand that I'm here for a reason. Dorothy Hayes, 18 years old. You met her Sunday night at Willie's Diner. You left with her, and sometime between 8 p.m. and midnight, you beat her to death in an alley on Lenox Avenue. I'm giving you one chance to tell the truth about what happened. One chance to confess. One chance to face legal justice instead of the other kind. We didn't do nothing, DeLuca said, his voice shaking. We don't know no Dorothy Hayes. Bumpy pulled out photographs. Dorothy's graduation picture, crime scene photos showing her battered face, the composite sketches that matched DeLuca and Castellano perfectly. Witnesses saw you at the diner, leaving together. Your car was seen near the crime scene. Under Dorothy's fingernails are skin cells that will match your DNA when police test them. You did this. The only question is whether you admit it now or whether I hand you directly to Dorothy's family and let them decide your punishment. Castellano broke first. It was an accident. We didn't mean to kill her. Shut up, DeLuca hissed. I'm not going down for murder when it was your idea, Castellano shot back. I just wanted to scare her. Scare her why? Bumpy asked, his voice still quiet. Because she was a... Castellano caught himself, looked at the faces surrounding him, understood that the word he was about to say would result in immediate violence. She rejected us. Frances wanted to date her. She said no. Said she wasn't interested in white guys. Frances got mad. Said she needed to be taught a lesson. So we should take her somewhere and rough her up a little. Show her she can't just reject people. So you beat an 18-year-old girl to death because she wouldn't date your friend. It wasn't supposed to go that far, Castellano said, tears starting now. Frances just kept hitting her. She fought back, and it made a matter. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't stop. By the time he was done, she wasn't moving. DeLuca lunged at Castellano, but was stopped by 2 of Bumpy's men. You fucking coward. You hit her too. Don't act like this was all me. I hit her because you told me to. You said we were just going to scare her. You're the one who killed her. Bumpy let them argue, let the accusations fly, let Alice, the stenographer, document every word. After 5 minutes, he raised his hand for silence. Here's what happens now. You're going to repeat everything you just said to the NYPD. You go to confess. You're going to plead guilty. And you're going to serve whatever sentence the court gives you. Or, he let that hang. Or what? DeLuca asked. Or, I let word spread in Harlem about 2 white men who beat Dorothy Hayes to death. Let people know where you live, where you work, where your families live. Let nature take its course. Your choice. That's vigilante justice, DeLuca said. No, Bumpy replied. Vigilante justice is what would happen if I wasn't giving you the option of legal process. I'm offering you legitimate prosecution, legitimate justice, legitimate consequences. The alternative isn't justice at all. It's just consequences. Raymond Marcus spoke up. Mr. DeLuca, Mr. Castellano, I'm an attorney. I'm recording this conversation as your voluntary confession given without physical coercion. You've been offered the opportunity to surrender to police and face legitimate legal process. I strongly advise you to take that option. Reverend Kilgore added, Gentlemen, what you did was evil, unforgivable, but you can still choose to face earthly justice through proper channels, where you can refuse and face something worse. Choose wisely. At 3:17 a.m., 70 hours and 17 minutes after Dorothy's body was discovered, Francis DeLuca and Robert Castellano agreed to confess to police. July 25, 1956, 8 a.m. Detective William Murphy arrived at the 28th precinct for his morning shift and found something unusual. Two white men sitting in the precinct waiting area, accompanied by Raymond Marcus, a well-known Harlem attorney. Detective Murphy, Marcus said, "These gentlemen have information about the Dorothy Hayes homicide. They'd like to make a statement." Murphy looked at the two men, both disheveled, clearly frightened, neither of whom looked like they'd slept. "Who are you?" "Francis DeLuca. This is Robert Castellano. We were with Dorothy Hayes the night she died. We want to confess." Murphy blinked. This was unprecedented. Suspects voluntarily confessing to a murder that police hadn't even connected them to yet? Something was wrong. You're confessing to murder? They're confessing to their involvement in Dorothy Hayes' death, Marcus corrected. They're prepared to provide detailed statements, submit to forensic examination, and cooperate fully with prosecution. I'm here to ensure their confession is properly documented and their rights are protected. Murphy looked at Marcus suspiciously. How did they come to retain your services? They were referred to me by someone concerned that justice be served properly. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that you now have confessed perpetrators in a homicide case that was going nowhere. I suggest you take their statements before they change their minds. Over the next 4 hours, DeLuca and Castellano confessed to everything. They described meeting Dorothy at the diner, convincing her to take a ride with them, driving to the alley on Lenox Avenue, the argument that escalated into violence, the beating that killed her. They provided details that only the killers would know: what Dorothy was wearing, what she said before she died, how they disposed of the weapon, thrown into the Harlem River from the Willis Avenue Bridge. Forensic examination confirmed skin under Dorothy's fingernails matched both men. Witnesses identified them from photographs. The case that Murphy had thought would go unsolved was suddenly airtight. At 1 p.m., Murphy called Geneva Hayes to inform her that suspects had been arrested and confessed. "Who found them?" Geneva asked. "You told me this case would be difficult." Murphy hesitated. "They came forward with an attorney. They confessed voluntarily." Geneva understood what that meant. Understood who had found them. Understood that justice for her daughter had come not from the NYPD, but from her brother-in-law's connections to Bumpy Johnson. "Thank you, Detective, for everything you did." "I didn't do much, ma'am. The case solved itself." "No," Geneva said quietly. "Someone solved it, and I know who. Tell him I'm grateful." Murphy hung up, filed his report, and never asked questions about how two suspects in a Harlem homicide had voluntarily surrendered with confessions and attorney representation 72 hours after the crime. Some things were better left unexamined. Francis DeLuca and Robert Castellano were charged with second-degree murder. Their attorney, different from Raymond Marcus, attempted to claim the confessions were coerced, but the stenographer's transcript, the presence of Reverend Kilgore as witness, and the lack of any physical evidence of brutalization made that defense untenable. The trial began in October 1956. Both men pleaded guilty to reduced charges of manslaughter in exchange for 25-year sentences. They would be eligible for parole in 15 years if they maintained good behavior. Geneva Hayes attended every day of the trial, sat in the front row, watched the men who'd killed her daughter face consequences. When the judge sentenced them, she allowed herself to cry, not from joy, but from the hollow satisfaction of knowing that Dorothy's death hadn't been forgotten or dismissed. But the case left scars beyond Geneva's grief. The Amsterdam News ran a story asking uncomfortable questions about how DeLuca and Castellano had been found and convinced to confess. The implication was clear: Bumpy Johnson had conducted a parallel investigation that succeeded where police failed, but had done so through methods that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The NYPD was embarrassed. Detective Murphy and his superiors resented that a criminal had solved a case they couldn't. There was talk of investigating whether DeLuca and Castellano had been illegally detained or coerced, but nothing came of it. Partly because pursuing that would mean admitting the NYPD's investigation was incompetent, partly because no one wanted to examine too closely how justice had actually been achieved. And Bumpy Johnson faced his own consequences. Raymond Marcus warned him, "What you did worked. Dorothy's killers are in prison. Her family has closure. But you've also demonstrated that you can conduct investigations, extract confessions, and deliver suspects to police. That makes you look too powerful, too independent. The NYPD doesn't like that. The DA doesn't like that. You've embarrassed them, and embarrassed institutions find ways to retaliate. So what do you suggest?" Bumpy asked. "Be prepared for increased scrutiny. More arrests, more harassment, more attempts to prove you're operating criminal enterprises. You've won this battle, but you've also made enemies who will remember this." Marcus was right. Over the next 2 years, Bumpy would be arrested 11 times on various charges, most dismissed, some resulting in brief jail terms. The NYPD never forgot that he'd solved Dorothy Hayes' murder in 72 hours while they'd accomplished nothing. But Harlem remembered too. Remembered that when an 18-year-old girl was killed, when police investigation went nowhere, when it seemed like justice would never come, Bumpy Johnson had delivered it. Not perfectly, not through official channels, but delivered it nonetheless. If you've been following this story, if you've seen how one murder triggered 72 hours of intensive investigation that resulted in confessions and convictions, you understand something profound about power and justice in 1956 Harlem. Official authority had procedures, regulations, legal frameworks, but also had limitations, biases, and failures. Informal power operated outside those frameworks, but could achieve results the official system couldn't. That doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it legal. Doesn't mean we should celebrate vigilante justice or extra-legal investigations. But it reveals the complexity of communities where official justice often failed and where people developed alternative systems because they had no other choice. They killed an 18-year-old girl on July 23, 1956. Dorothy Hayes, beaten to death in an alley for the crime of rejecting unwanted attention from men who couldn't accept no for an answer. The NYPD conducted a routine investigation that yielded nothing. Detective Murphy interviewed witnesses who wouldn't talk to police, filed reports that led nowhere, and resigned himself to another unsolved case in a neighborhood where unsolved cases were common. Bumpy Johnson heard about Dorothy's death through family connections and made a decision. This wouldn't stand. This wouldn't be accepted. This wouldn't be another statistic that Harlem just absorbed. In 72 hours, 3 days, Bumpy's organization conducted an investigation that interviewed dozens of witnesses, reconstructed Dorothy's last movements, identified suspects through community intelligence, located and surveilled the perpetrators, extracted confessions through psychological pressure, delivered the suspects to police with documented evidence. Francis DeLuca and Robert Castellano served 15 years before parole. Dorothy Hayes' murder was solved and justice, imperfect but real, was achieved. But the cost was complexity. The methods weren't legal. The investigation wasn't official. The confession was obtained through coercion, even if not through violence. Bumpy Johnson had delivered justice, but had done so by operating outside every legal framework that supposedly governed such matters. What shocked Harlem wasn't the violence. Harlem had seen violence before. What shocked Harlem was the speed, the efficiency, and the demonstration that when Bumpy Johnson decided something needed to be done, it got done. 3 days, 72 hours, 1 dead girl, 2 confessed killers. Justice delivered. The story became legend. The details were embellished over years. Some claimed Bumpy personally beat the confessions out of the suspects. Others said he paid off witnesses. Still others insisted the whole thing was orchestrated to embarrass police. None of that was true. What was true was simpler and more powerful. When official justice failed, when the NYPD couldn't or wouldn't solve Dorothy Hayes' murder, when it looked like her killers would never face consequences, Bumpy Johnson found them, confronted them, and forced them to confess. 3 days. That's all it took. 3 days to shock Harlem. 3 days to demonstrate power that operated parallel to law enforcement. 3 days to show that justice, when pursued with resources and determination and intelligence, could be achieved outside official channels. Dorothy Hayes was buried on July 28, 1956. Her killers were in custody. Her mother had closure, and Harlem had learned a lesson about who actually protected the community when it mattered most. That lesson, uncomfortable, complex, impossible to celebrate without acknowledging its problems, remains relevant today whenever communities face failures of official justice and must decide whether to accept those failures or seek alternative paths to accountability. Bumpy Johnson chose the alternative path. 3 days later, Dorothy Hayes' killers were confessing to murder. And Harlem understood once again that power, justice, and law aren't always the same thing. But sometimes, just sometimes, they can point in the same direction, even if the path between them runs through shadows.